In the bright hotel lobby during the glittering charity gala, Mason Carter only wanted to return the small forgotten hard drive before his long night shift began. But Jackson Cole, the towering bodyguard of CEO Amelia Hayes, blocked him in front of the crowd and roared, "Get out of here!" Cold laughter rippled through the expensive suits. Mason stayed still, hand resting on the edge of his chair, eyes fixed on the elevator behind Amelia. When he finally rose, the entire lobby fell silent, because the giant bodyguard had just noticed an old survival mark etched quietly along his wrist. If you love watching a proud man brought to his knees by the truth, stay until the very last second. Mason Carter was not a wealthy man, and he had never pretended to be one. He worked as an audio technician and part-time security systems assistant at the Grand Winslow Hotel, the kind of job that paid the bills but never made anyone stop and look twice. He took the night shifts other men avoided, the broken speaker repairs nobody wanted to deal with, even the tedious camera checks that meant crawling through service corridors long after the guests had gone home. He was not desperate, but he lived carefully, the way a man lives when every dollar has somewhere important to go. At home, a small boy waited for him most nights, though the boy never appeared in the story that was about to unfold. Mason had a simple rule for himself: call before bedtime every single night without exception. Tonight, because the gala had stretched longer than expected, that call was already running late, and the thought of it sat like a small stone in his chest as he moved through the crowded lobby. Years earlier, Mason had lived an entirely different life. He had worked in executive protection design, the quiet architecture behind how powerful people stayed safe in dangerous rooms. He was never the man who liked violence or the spotlight. His gift was reading danger before it arrived, tracing exit routes, watching where guards stood and where crowds naturally drifted, noticing the one detail that did not belong. That gift had once been valuable. Then a single incident had taken it all away. Officially, the record said Mason had missed a critical threat during a failed protection assignment. That single line had followed him for years, closing doors, ending a career built on trust that had somehow evaporated overnight. Nobody had ever asked him what really happened. Nobody had cared enough to look past the official version. Amelia Hayes was the opposite kind of person, at least on paper. Young, sharp, and recently thrust into leadership of Grace Shield after her father's death, she carried a company that no longer entirely trusted her. The board watched for her mistakes the way vultures watch a wounded animal, and the press waited eagerly for any sign that she was not ready for the chair she now occupied. Beside her stood Jackson Cole, her head of security, a mountain of a man whose loyalty was real but whose judgment leaned heavily on whoever gave the orders above him. Jackson believed in following the chain of command, and lately that chain led straight to Connor Ryan, the company's operations director. Connor was polished, charming, and endlessly reasonable in meetings, the sort of man boards loved because he never raised his voice. Underneath that calm exterior, however, Connor spent months quietly working to strip Amelia of control, positioning himself as the steady hand the company supposedly needed. The charity gala that night had been billed publicly as a fundraiser for community safety programs. Few people in that glittering room understood that Connor intended to turn the evening into something else entirely, a carefully built trap disguised as a celebration, one that had been quietly assembled over weeks while everyone else in the company remained entirely focused on flowers, seating charts, and photographers. Before the doors opened to the first guests, Mason had gone backstage to check the sound equipment one final time, moving through the narrow service area near the freight elevator control panel. That was when he saw it, a small hard drive lying almost hidden beside the panel, as though it had been dropped in a hurry and never noticed. He picked it up, meaning to hand it straight to security, but a detail stopped him cold. An internal label was fixed to the casing, one connected to the emergency systems of the executive floor above. Mason was not a curious man by nature, not in the way that led people into trouble. His curiosity was professional, the kind trained into him years ago, and professional instinct told him plainly that a drive like this had no business sitting in a service corridor. He carried it to a small internal terminal used for basic diagnostics, plugged it in, and watched several encrypted folders appear on the screen. Most of it meant nothing to him, but one log file opened briefly before the system flagged it, just long enough for Mason to read a single line. Amelia's private elevator route had been changed, rerouted from the main exit toward the rear delivery corridor of the hotel. Mason understood immediately what that meant. If Amelia left the gala through that particular elevator, she would be separated from the crowd and, more importantly, cut off from her own security detail. He looked for Jackson to report what he had found, but Jackson was deep in the crowd, escorting Amelia between clusters of donors and photographers, impossible to reach without causing a scene. Connor noticed Mason holding the drive before anyone else did, and something shifted behind his composed expression. He recognized instantly what kind of man was holding evidence that could unravel him. A low-ranking technician, easy to dismiss, easy to paint as a thief if things went wrong. Connor gave Jackson a brief signal across the room, subtle enough that no guest would notice, but unmistakable to a bodyguard trained to watch for exactly that kind of cue. It marked Mason as a potential problem before Mason had said a single word to anyone in charge. Mason tried to approach Amelia politely, choosing his moment carefully, but every eye in that room already treated him as someone who did not belong among the tailored suits and champagne glasses. He felt it the way he always did in rooms like this, the quiet judgment that came before anyone bothered to ask a single question. The tension sharpened further when Mason noticed two unfamiliar men standing near the service elevator, wearing earpieces meant to resemble hotel security equipment. Neither man wore a visible credential badge, the kind every legitimate staff member was required to display. Mason had spent years learning to notice exactly this sort of inconsistency, the small detail that meant everything once you knew how to look for it, and his pulse quickened as the pieces began settling into place around him, each detail landing with the quiet, mounting weight of a puzzle he had already seen solved somewhere before in his own life. Amelia walked into the gala wearing a smile that had taken years to perfect, though underneath it she was running on fumes. The board had scheduled a merger vote for the following morning, and if she stumbled even once tonight, Connor would gain exactly the leverage he needed to argue that the company required temporary oversight until she proved herself capable. Connor had spent months carefully positioning himself as her protector rather than her rival. He reminded her often, always gently, always at the right moment, that the company needed a firmer hand during this period of transition, someone steady while she found her footing. Jackson trusted Connor without much hesitation, largely because Connor was the one who had signed the contracts bringing in the newest members of the security team. That trust ran deep enough that Jackson rarely questioned instructions passed down through Connor's office. Mason watched Connor lean close to Jackson and whisper something brief. Moments later, Jackson shifted his position, moving to block the path between Mason and the rest of the room with the deliberate ease of a man following a direct order. Mason had no intention of causing a scene in front of hundreds of guests, but he understood the cost of waiting too long. If he hesitated much further, Amelia would already be walking toward that rigged elevator, and no warning delivered afterward would matter. He approached the VIP reception table and asked, as politely as he could manage, for 1 minute alone with Amelia. The young staff member behind the table hesitated, clearly unsure how to handle the request, before Connor stepped in and asked sharply what exactly Mason was holding in his hand. Mason answered honestly. He explained that the drive was connected to the elevator systems and needed to reach the right person immediately. For one brief instant, something flickered across Connor's face, gone almost before it appeared. Then the practiced smile returned, and Connor addressed the surrounding guests, calling Mason a paranoid technician who had wandered somewhere he should not be. Connor announced, loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, that Mason had already been caught lingering in a restricted area earlier that evening. It was not entirely true, but truth had never been the point. The accusation only needed to sound convincing for a few critical seconds. Jackson moved forward then, his broad frame swallowing most of the light in front of Mason. Mason kept his voice level, aware that the crowd had begun turning to watch, phones lowering slightly as curiosity overtook polite conversation. Somewhere nearby, a photographer's flash caught the edge of the confrontation, though no one yet understood what they were witnessing. Mason glanced past Jackson's shoulder toward the private elevator bank behind Amelia, and for one heartbeat the small indicator light above the doors flickered red, a signal so brief that only a trained eye would have caught it at all. Mason's had, and the tightening in his chest told him the countdown had already begun, whether anyone else in that glittering room realized it or not. He thought briefly of the small boy waiting at home, of the promise he had made to call before bedtime, and pushed the thought aside for now, knowing that whatever happened in the next few minutes mattered more than any late phone call ever could. Jackson planted himself directly in front of Mason and demanded that he hand over the drive immediately. Mason did not resist or raise his voice. He simply answered that he would give it to Miss Hayes herself, or to the police, but not to anyone without proper authority over the system it belonged to. That single sentence struck closer to the truth than Mason realized, because Connor had no interest whatsoever in police involvement, not with data like that circulating anywhere near an investigation. Connor leaned toward Jackson and murmured that Mason might be attempting to get close to the CEO with some kind of dangerous device, a suggestion carefully designed to ignite exactly the reaction he wanted. Jackson's temper snapped. In front of hundreds of guests, his voice thundered across the marble floor. Get out of here! The room fell into a strange heavy silence for several seconds before quiet laughter began rippling through the crowd. A few wealthy guests glanced at Mason with open contempt, as if a beggar had somehow wandered uninvited into their private celebration. Mason remained seated at the edge of a nearby chair near the exit, his hands resting visibly in plain sight, posture calm and utterly non-threatening. Amelia noticed the commotion from across the room but had no context yet, seeing only her own bodyguard forcing out a hotel technician who apparently did not belong. Mason kept his eyes away from Jackson entirely. Instead, he looked past Jackson's shoulder, straight toward the private elevator behind Amelia. The small indicator light above the doors blinked red again, one brief pulse that vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. Only Mason noticed it. He understood, with a cold certainty settling in his stomach, that very little time remained before the trap activated fully. Every second spent arguing was a second closer to losing the one advantage he still held, the simple fact that he alone had seen the warning. Jackson stepped closer, his hand rising to grip the collar of Mason's jacket, ready to physically remove him from the premises in front of everyone watching. That was the exact moment Mason chose to rise from his seat. He did not stand quickly or defensively. He rose slowly, deliberately, hands open at his sides, shoulders relaxed in a way that suggested no threat at all, only quiet certainty. It was the stillness of a man who had faced far worse rooms than this one and had learned long ago that panic never solved anything worth solving. Something about that calm made Jackson's raised hand hesitate mid-air, though he could not yet explain why. A normal man, cornered by a bodyguard twice his size in front of an entire ballroom, would have flinched, apologized, or fled toward the doors. Mason did none of those things, and the absence of fear in his eyes felt, to Jackson, oddly and uncomfortably familiar, like a memory trying to surface from somewhere deep and half-forgotten. A fragment of a night he had never fully understood until this very moment, standing under the bright chandeliers of the Grand Winslow. A memory he had never been able to fully place until this very second. Jackson's gaze dropped to Mason's wrist and caught on a thin scar running just beneath an old worn band. It was faint, easy to miss unless someone already knew exactly what they were looking for. That scar connected to a memory Jackson had carried for years without ever fully understanding it. Long ago, during the North Bridge evacuation, Jackson had been a young bodyguard trapped inside a collapsing crowd, moments from being crushed against a locked gate, when an unnamed specialist had pulled him free and guided him to safety through a route nobody else had seen. Jackson had never learned that man's name. But he remembered one training signal burned permanently into his memory, a gesture the stranger had used again and again that night. A slight turn of the left wrist meant the path ahead was clear. Mason turned his wrist now, not as a display of pride, but as a quiet signal directing Jackson's attention toward the elevator behind them. Jackson went completely still. Whatever anger had driven him moments earlier dissolved instantly into confusion and something close to disbelief. Amelia noticed her bodyguard's sudden loss of composure and asked sharply what exactly was happening. Mason spoke quietly, just loud enough for her alone to hear. "Do not get into that elevator behind you." Connor pushed forward immediately, ordering Jackson to remove Mason from the building without further delay. At that exact instant, the lights across the lobby flickered once, then twice. The doors of the private VIP elevator slid open on their own, though no one standing nearby had pressed a single button. Two unfamiliar men stood inside wearing hotel uniforms that did not quite match the real staff, their polished tactical boots completely out of place beneath the formal fabric. Mason did not lunge forward or throw a single punch. He simply dragged a nearby service cart into the gap of the elevator doors, wedging it firmly enough that the doors could not fully close again. Panic rippled instantly through the crowd, gasps and shuffling feet echoing across the marble floor as guests began backing away from the sudden commotion near the elevator bank. Connor tried to seize the opportunity, pushing Amelia toward the very same elevator under the pretense of guiding her somewhere safer, away from the growing chaos. Mason recognized the maneuver immediately for what it truly was. The real danger in that room was never waiting somewhere outside in the crowd. It had been built directly into the false evacuation route itself, disguised as rescue, engineered as a trap from the very beginning. He raised his voice just enough to be heard over the rising noise, asking everyone nearby to hold their positions rather than surge toward the main doors, warning that if the crowd pressed forward now, Amelia would be pulled apart from whatever protection remained around her. Jackson, still shaken by the flood of memory rushing back to him, found himself listening to Mason's instructions almost without deciding to, some old instinct from years ago quietly overriding the last of his hesitation, a feeling he could not yet name but no longer felt any need to resist. Amelia, too, found herself trusting the calm voice of a stranger over the panic building around her, some part of her recognizing that true danger rarely announced itself with shouting, and that the man everyone had just mocked was the only person in the room speaking without a trace of fear in his voice. Mason pointed toward a small camera mounted in the ceiling corner and spoke directly to Jackson. "If that camera is dead right now, you already know I am telling the truth." Jackson glanced at the small monitor carried by the nearest security staff member and confirmed it instantly. The feed from the VIP elevator camera had gone completely dark, exactly as Mason had predicted only seconds earlier. The two imposters attempted to step fully out of the elevator car, but Mason used the service cart along with a nearby fire extinguisher to create a brief cloud of confusion, enough to disorient them without causing serious injury to anyone nearby. Jackson lunged forward and pinned one of the men against the wall, while the second imposter tried to grab Amelia and pull her backward into the elevator car before the cart could be fully removed. Mason grabbed a length of stage microphone cable from the equipment table and looped it swiftly around the second man's wrist, yanking hard enough to throw off his balance just as he reached for Amelia's arm. The sudden shift bought Amelia enough space to stumble backward, out of reach, her security instincts finally kicking in as she moved away from the elevator doors entirely. The entire room seemed to change its opinion of Mason within the span of a single breath. The man who had just been thrown out amid public laughter was now quite plainly the only person who had seen the danger coming at all. Connor tried to salvage the situation, raising his voice to accuse Mason of staging the entire scene purely to appear heroic in front of Amelia and the assembled guests. Mason did not bother arguing with him. Instead, he walked directly to Amelia and placed the small hard drive firmly into her hand. "The answer is on there," he said simply. Amelia looked at him then, really looked at him, for what felt like the first time all evening. She was no longer seeing a hotel technician who did not belong in her world. She was seeing the man who had just quietly saved her life while everyone else in the room had been busy laughing at his expense. Security staff rushed to secure the two imposters while hotel management scrambled to restore full power to the lobby lighting. Jackson stood over the restrained man, breathing hard, glancing occasionally toward Mason with an expression that mixed confusion, gratitude, and something close to shame. Connor's composure cracked slightly at the edges, though he quickly forced a tight smile back into place, insisting loudly to nearby staff that everything would be sorted out properly once the confusion settled down. Amelia held the small drive tightly in her palm, aware now that whatever it contained explained far more than a simple lost item ever could. She turned toward the small security office tucked behind the main desk and asked, with quiet authority returning to her voice, for everyone involved to follow her there immediately. Her tone carrying an authority the room had not heard from her all evening, one that made even the lingering staff members straighten and step aside. Amelia insisted that Mason, Jackson, and Connor all be brought into a private security room so the data could be examined properly, away from the noise and confusion still settling over the main lobby. Connor objected loudly, arguing that Mason had absolutely no right to touch any part of the company's internal systems, credentials or not. Amelia answered flatly that from the moment Mason had pulled her away from that elevator, he had earned the right to be heard, whether Connor approved of it or not. Inside the security room, the drive was connected to an isolated diagnostic machine, away from the hotel's main network entirely. The data confirmed exactly what Mason had already suspected. Amelia's evacuation route had been altered nearly 2 hours before the gala began, using access credentials far above anything a low-level technician could ever obtain. Connor still tried to twist the narrative, pulling up an old employment file and displaying it for the room. He announced that Mason had once been dismissed from the protection industry entirely, following an incident that had nearly cost a client their life. Jackson's expression wavered at that revelation, uncertainty creeping back into his features. Amelia fell silent as well, watching Mason carefully for some sign of guilt or denial. Mason did not deny the record. He confirmed quietly that yes, his name did appear in that file, but the file itself told only half the story, the half someone else had carefully arranged for the world to see. Years earlier, Mason had designed the protection protocol for a major corporation's leadership team. During what later became known as the North Bridge incident, he had discovered that someone inside the organization was secretly selling protection schedules to outside buyers. To save the group under his protection that night, Mason had abandoned the official procedure entirely and guided everyone through an unauthorized secondary exit instead. Among those he personally pulled to safety was a young, inexperienced bodyguard, a man who would later become known throughout the industry simply as Jackson Cole. Afterward, the person responsible for the original leak quietly altered the incident report, rewriting the story so that Mason appeared to be the one who had acted recklessly and against protocol. rather than the one who had prevented a tragedy from unfolding. Mason lost his job almost immediately. His reputation collapsed along with it, and he was forced to rebuild his life from nothing, starting over with the kind of overnight technical work nobody else wanted. He was not telling this story now to earn anyone's sympathy. He simply wanted Amelia to understand that the pattern Connor was using tonight matched almost exactly the pattern used against him years earlier. Slowly, pieces of long-buried memory began surfacing in Jackson's mind, fragments of that chaotic night finally aligning into something coherent. For the first time, he allowed himself to consider that the stranger who had saved his life all those years ago might be standing directly in front of him right now, holding nothing but a small hard drive and an old, quiet truth nobody had wanted to hear, a truth that had waited patiently for years to finally find a room willing to listen. Connor understood immediately that if the data continued being decoded, his own involvement would eventually surface for everyone to see. He needed to act quickly, before the picture became too clear for anyone to dismiss. He called his personal legal counsel and instructed the auxiliary security staff to prepare a formal statement claiming that Mason had stolen hard drive, interfered with the hotel's private systems, and caused significant disruption during a major fundraising event. Outside the building, journalists had already begun receiving leaked fragments of the story. Early reports suggested that CEO Amelia Hayes had narrowly avoided an attack caused by a suspicious hotel employee acting alone. Amelia found herself trapped between two difficult choices. She could trust Mason, a man with a troubled professional history and almost no standing within her world, or she could trust Connor, someone who had worked closely beside her for years and had never given her obvious reason to doubt him before tonight. Mason saw the flicker of uncertainty return to Amelia's eyes, and it hurt more than he expected, though it did not entirely surprise him. He had grown used to being judged before anyone bothered asking him a single honest question. Jackson wanted desperately to apologize to Mason for the humiliation in the lobby, but the words would not quite come, guilt and confusion tangling together in his throat. Connor pressed his advantage further, warning Amelia privately that if she continued protecting Mason after everything on record, the board would view it as further proof that she lacked the judgment necessary to lead the company through this crisis. Reluctantly, Amelia allowed security to escort Mason out of the room while the legal team continued reviewing the remaining data, promising him nothing beyond a temporary pause in the investigation. Mason did not raise his voice or protest the decision. He simply placed his technical access card back on the table and told Amelia, calmly, that she should check the elevator logs for the basement level next, not merely the gala floor where everyone's attention remained fixed. Before leaving, Mason received a brief call from home. He kept his voice gentle and unhurried, telling the small voice on the other end that he would be later than planned but that everything was still fine, promising a proper conversation once he finally made it through the door. The call did not last long, and afterward Mason simply stood in the hallway for a moment, gathering himself before stepping back out toward the lobby entrance. Once outside, Mason looked back at the hotel one final time, something in his gut refusing to settle. If Connor's plan at the VIP elevator had failed completely, a man like that would already have a second option waiting quietly in reserve, ready to be triggered the moment the first one collapsed. Standing alone on the sidewalk, Mason understood with growing certainty that whatever tonight had truly been about, it was very far from finished yet, and that the quiet hours before dawn would decide far more than anyone inside that lobby currently realized. Mason left the hotel but did not go straight home. Instead, he crossed the street and stood quietly in the shadows, watching the building's various exits with the patient attention of a man who had spent years learning exactly what to look for. He noticed a service truck parked incorrectly near the basement-level entrance, positioned in a way that violated every standard safety protocol for a night when a company's CEO remained inside the building. Under normal security procedures, service vehicles were never permitted to sit in that exact spot while a high-profile executive was still present anywhere on the premises. Mason understood then that Connor intended to trigger a false alarm, one designed to force Amelia down toward the basement level, where the cameras had already been quietly swapped for a looped recording of an empty, harmless corridor. He no longer carried his technical access card. He no longer had any official standing inside the building, and nobody currently trusted him enough to simply let him back through the front entrance. Still, Mason made his way back inside through a maintenance corridor he had personally inspected earlier that same afternoon, one he knew by memory even without his credentials. Inside, Jackson received an urgent alert reporting a fire emergency, though nothing about it felt right the moment it reached him. Under the newly revised protocol Connor had personally approved only days earlier, Jackson was required to guide Amelia toward the basement level instead of the main exit everyone would normally expect. Jackson remembered Mason's earlier warning. "Check the basement," the man had told him, quiet and certain, back before any of tonight's chaos had even begun. This time, Jackson did not simply follow Connor's instructions without question. He demanded immediate verification from the real camera feeds before moving Amelia anywhere at all. Connor's composure slipped visibly, and he snapped at Jackson to follow the emergency protocol exactly as written, his voice rising with an urgency that felt far too personal for a simple fire drill. Amelia caught the brief flash of fear crossing Connor's face, and something inside her shifted permanently. She understood, with sudden clarity, that the dangerous man in this story had never been the quiet technician everyone had been so eager to blame. Mason appeared in the service hallway just as the electronic locks began sealing shut section by section, part of the same false emergency sequence Connor had triggered only moments earlier. Drawing on knowledge from another lifetime, Mason managed to hold one emergency door open for a few crucial extra seconds, just long enough for Amelia and Jackson to slip past before the automated trap route could fully close around them. Two men disguised as maintenance staff rushed toward them from the far end of the corridor. This time, Jackson positioned himself firmly beside Mason rather than against him, the two men finally standing shoulder to shoulder against the very danger neither of them had fully understood alone, bound now by a single quiet truth that had taken years to finally surface between them. Somewhere above them, the false alarm continued blaring uselessly through empty corridors, a signal meant to herd panic in one direction, now serving only to mask the sound of two men finally standing on the same side of a fight neither of them had chosen. The basement level felt darker and colder than the glittering lobby above, filled with the low hum of machinery and the persistent wail of a false alarm still echoing through the concrete corridors. Connor appeared there himself, flanked by two of his men, his polished charm entirely gone now, replaced by something far more desperate and exposed. He told Amelia bluntly that all she needed to do was sign the emergency transfer document, and everything would be resolved quietly, without further complication for anyone involved. Amelia understood at last that this was never simply an isolated security incident. This was a deliberate takeover unfolding inside her own company, engineered from the shadows over many months of careful planning. Connor's true goal had always been to make her appear panicked, unstable, and incapable of steady leadership, then present the board with a story of her voluntarily surrendering control during a moment of supposed crisis. Mason spoke calmly, laying out the pattern for everyone present: a false alarm, an altered evacuation route, disabled cameras, a hard drive deliberately discarded near the technical area, every single piece constructed to support one carefully manufactured story. Connor sneered at him, insisting that nobody in that boardroom would ever believe a disgraced single father, with a ruined professional reputation over a respected operations director with years of company loyalty behind him. That was the moment Jackson finally stepped forward. In front of everyone gathered in that basement corridor, Jackson openly admitted that Mason was the very man who had once saved his life during the North Bridge evacuation years earlier. He said plainly that Mason was never a failure. He was a man who had been buried and discredited to protect people who held far more power than he ever had. Connor ordered his remaining men to restrain Mason immediately, his voice cracking under the pressure of watching his carefully built plan finally begin to unravel. Mason and Jackson worked together instinctively. Jackson relied on raw strength while Mason relied on strategy, quickly locking down a rolling security gate and activating the basement sprinkler system, which soaked the corridor and exposed muddy footprints, tangled cables, and discarded equipment belonging to Connor's hired men. Lisa Madison, an independent security investigator Amelia had secretly contacted earlier that same evening, arrived alongside two hotel security officers, moving quickly to secure the scene before anything further could happen. Connor was placed under restraint on the spot, still shouting that Amelia would never manage to hold on to control of the company without him standing beside her. Nobody in that flooded basement corridor believed him anymore, least of all Amelia herself, who stood quietly beside Mason and Jackson, watching the man who had spent months undermining her finally run out of lies to offer, his voice fading into the drone of the sprinklers and the distant approach of hotel security radios crackling through the wet, echoing corridor. The following morning, the board convened an emergency session. Connor remained in custody, though his remaining allies still tried to soften the entire situation into little more than a simple security misunderstanding. Amelia walked into the meeting room looking exhausted but somehow steadier than she had appeared in weeks, as though the previous night's chaos had finally burned away every last trace of hesitation left in her. Mason had no desire to appear before the board at all. He intended only to hand over the remaining data and quietly leave the building behind him for good. Amelia insisted that he stay. The truth, she told him plainly, could not keep being discussed behind his back as though he were not entitled to be part of the conversation. Lisa Madison presented the full evidence to the room. Connor's elevated system access, the contracts hiring the imposter maintenance crew, detailed files outlining how to stage a convincing false alarm, and a clear plan to pressure Amelia into signing away control during a manufactured emergency. More significantly, Lisa had uncovered older records connected directly to the North Bridge incident, records that confirmed Mason had been wrongfully blamed for a failure that was never actually his fault. The original report, it turned out, had been deliberately altered years earlier by a group of interested parties with direct ties to Connor's earlier career, long before he had ever joined Grace Shield. Jackson stood before the assembled board members and offered a formal apology to Mason for humiliating him publicly the night before. Mason did not offer easy forgiveness in return. He said plainly that an apology could never erase years of lost opportunity and quiet suffering, but that having the truth finally restored was something he had waited an extremely long time to hear spoken aloud. Amelia turned to face the board directly and announced that the scheduled transfer of power vote was officially canceled, effective immediately. She went further, dismissing every member of Connor's inner circle involved in the scheme, ordering a full independent audit of the company's security practices, and formally restoring Mason's professional record and reputation within the industry he had once been forced to leave behind. The story had turned completely, from a man being thrown out of a glittering lobby amid mocking laughter to that very same man standing quietly at the center of a boardroom, while every single person present listened closely to whatever he chose to say next. Nobody in that room laughed now. Nobody looked away or dismissed him as someone who did not belong. For the first time in longer than he could easily remember, Mason felt the simple, uncomplicated weight of being truly heard, and for a brief moment that quiet feeling meant more to him than any apology the room could possibly have offered him that morning. A few days later, the hotel lobby had been fully restored after the scandal, its bright gala lighting long since dimmed back down to the hotel's usual quiet evening glow. The laughter and whispered contempt of that night were gone, replaced now by an almost peaceful stillness. Mason returned only to collect his old toolbox, intending to formally end his technical contract with the hotel and move quietly on with his life. Amelia met him in the exact spot where Jackson had once roared at him to leave, though this time no crowd gathered around them and no bodyguard stood blocking his path. She told him she had no interest in hiring him merely as some kind of public relations symbol. She wanted him to redesign the entire security framework at Grace Shield, because he was the only person who had ever looked at the people around him before looking at their titles. Mason hesitated. He had no desire to return to a world that had once destroyed nearly everything he had built for himself. Amelia did not pressure him. Instead, she simply placed a corrected copy of his old report on the table between them, one where his name had finally been cleared and his reputation formally restored. Jackson stepped forward next, his earlier hostility completely gone. He told Mason quietly that from now on, if Mason ever stood up in a room like that again, Jackson would know instantly that it was never a sign of trouble but a sign that something important needed saving. Mason allowed himself a small, quiet smile. He agreed to accept the role as an independent consultant on one condition. Whatever new system they built together had to protect every ordinary employee just as carefully as it protected executives and board members. Mason walked out of the hotel just as dawn began breaking softly over the city skyline. He called home once more, telling the voice on the other end that everything was finally settled and calm. The small boy on the other end of that call was never shown directly, only felt through Mason's steady, reassuring voice as he walked quietly toward whatever came next. The man who had once been ordered to leave that lobby in front of a laughing crowd no longer needed to prove that he belonged there. The truth itself had already opened every door that mattered, quietly and without fanfare, exactly the way real redemption so often arrives, unannounced and long overdue, arriving quietly at dawn instead of loudly in the glare of a crowded ballroom, the way most true endings tend to arrive when nobody is watching for them at all. Somewhere beyond the hotel doors, the city was only beginning to stir, unaware of how close disaster had come to a quiet lobby the night before, and unaware that the man once ordered out of it had been the very reason it never happened. Every so often, life hands someone a single quiet moment to prove exactly who they really are, and Mason Carter never once raised his voice to do it. He simply stood up, calm and unshaken, while an entire room full of powerful people had already decided he was nothing worth noticing. That single decision to remain steady, to trust what he had spent years learning to see, changed the course of a company, restored a man's stolen reputation, and reminded everyone watching that true strength rarely announces itself with shouting. If this story moved you, if you found yourself rooting for the quiet man everyone underestimated, share it with someone who needs a reminder that dignity always outlasts humiliation, and that the truth, however long buried, eventually finds its way back into the light.